Hi, I'm Mark Eade, a partner at Blick Rothenberg. I'm here today with Neil Insull, a fellow tax partner, to talk about the tax deductibility of interest in the context of real estate businesses and structures. Neil, in your opinion, what are the biggest and most pressing issues for businesses at the minute?
Well, I think in the property industry, I think the real question is whether property businesses, whether they're developers, investors, or any other company connected with the property sector, are getting a full deduction for their interest expense, particularly at a time when interest rates are higher than they were a number of years ago. Maybe we're not going to see significant increases going forward, but we're at a level where interest rates are high and people are spending more money on their debt and want a tax deduction for it. The three areas I think which are worth talking about today, if only quite briefly, because we could be here for hours if we were going to go into the level of detail that I think they probably merit. Firstly, transfer pricing. So we can talk about transfer pricing. The second one we can talk about is corporate interest restriction. And the third one is unallowable purpose test. And we can put some flesh on the bones around those with talking about some real life examples. Just to give you a flavour of what each of those mean. Transfer pricing, it's been around a long time. It's that set of rules which essentially stop companies taking a tax deduction for interest in excess of what would be a commercially reasonable level of interest. And that equates not only to the price of the debt, so the interest charges, but also the amount of the debt and whether they're borrowing what a separate entity that's completely independent of any other members of the group could be borrowing. And obviously in a group context, transfer pricing is a very prevalent issue, and while it is intended to be primarily focused at large corporates, I think we're seeing that now coming into play in the mid-market area as well. So transfer pricing is a key area. Corporate interest restriction, introduced in 2017, so relatively recent legislation. That's intended to, stop companies taking an excessive interest amount in the UK. The rule is primarily around a level of interest deduction compared to debt, compared to profit. So the primary rule there is a 30% deduction, essentially. There's 30% of EBITDA, and any excess of that is disallowed and essentially carry forward to a point where that could be used in the future. And on top of that, there is an amount which is essentially guaranteed to be deducted, which is a level of £2 million. Now, just worth pausing there and talking about this £2 million of de minimis interest expense which is allowable. That £2 million was set at a time when base rates in the UK were 0.25% back in 2017. And companies were borrowing maybe a secured debt at 3%, and you could borrow in excess of £60 million and still not get over the £2 million of interest deduction. That world has changed now. We're not at 0.25, we're at 4.5% base rate. People are borrowing at maybe 8, 9, 10 in excess of that as an interest cost. You're looking at maybe only being able to borrow 25 million, maybe 20 million, and then you fall into the rules which take you above the £2 million de minimis mark, and then you're into whether I can get a full deduction for my interest. So corporate interest restriction is a significant area of risk for a lot of group companies, and the complexity of those rules is pretty horrendous, actually, Mark. So that's the second area of rules which are definitely worth the property market to take seriously. And the last one is unallowable purpose, and that's essentially a rule which has again been around for a very long time, but there's been, as you know, Mark, a lot of case law recently in the last few years around what is an unallowable purpose, and the rules are there essentially to strike down opportunities to take debt where there isn't a commercial purpose to the loan. So that could be something that's outside of the scope of corporation tax, or where there's clearly a tax purpose or tax avoidance purpose to taking the level of debt that the company has. So transfer pricing, think cap, corporate interest restriction, CIR, and unallowable purpose, I think, are the three biggest issues for the property industry to take into account in thinking about, can I get a full deduction for interest? What are your thoughts around maybe the unallowable purpose point, because that's something that you've seen recently?
Thanks, Neil. I think that's a really good summary. Trying to bring this to life a bit and touching on your point around unallowable purpose, I've been working with a client for a number of years now, which is it's a multinational real estate fund structure. They've got a reasonably significant amount of interest and debt, but their interest is in the region of, let's say, 8 to 10 million. Obviously that has increased significantly over the last 3-4 years. Historically, pre-CIR, pre the recent changes to the unallowable purpose rules, they had to think about transfer pricing in terms of quantum and percentage of interest rate. They were happy on that front, but actually starting to overlay the unallowable purpose test in its kind of updated form, there is risk there. There's clear risk of that impacting the first point of, can you deduct any interest, just because of how it's been structured in the past, which does have a commercial rationale, but there is clear risk there. Overlaying all of that is the corporate interest restriction, and again, because of how it was structured, there is only the de minimis of 2 million deduction in that business. Clearly, to your point earlier, when the interest rate is lower, then the impact is a lot lower. Given the interest rate has significantly increased over recent years, then the impact on their business, their margins, it's eroding the profitability of that business, and ultimately there's going to be questions over the viability if this continues.
Do you think companies are taking that into account in thinking about how much debt they're going to be raising and the opportunities that get those deductions? Is that something?
I think they have to. Yeah, I think they have to be taking that into account, and they have to be modelling it up front. Some cases you're going to have to take a worst case scenario. You're going to have to assume that you're going to be restricted to the 2 million, or even if it's being put in for non-commercial reasons, then there's a clear risk that none of it's going to be deducted. But I think you're right. I think businesses have to take that into account today when they're looking forward and their viability of the projects. I
think you're absolutely right, Mark. I think in terms of those three areas, I think before CIR was introduced, people were very conscious of whether they're in the transfer pricing rules, and then perhaps thinking about the unallowable purpose. I think what we're seeing now is all three areas being very prevalent to decisions about how much debt can be taken by a business. In particular, CIR. CIR is the first port of call in terms of thinking about those deductions. I mean, CIR will bite first, essentially, and will essentially stop companies borrowing excessive amounts in any case. And then, clearly, when the CIR rules are intended to give an opportunity to make deductions in the future, perhaps because they're now in a position of better profitability, I think it's that point where those transfer pricing rules are going to take effect and actually potentially restrict even those reactivated amounts that are coming into play after the CIR restrictions in the first place. But I think it's a minefield, isn't it, Mark?
We've only touched on a few of the issues as well. We haven't touched on things like the anti-hybrid rules that could overlay it. Yeah, there's a whole heap of tax anti-avoidance rules that can be in play to consider. So you're absolutely right, it is completely
fortunately, there are experts around, both within Blick Rothenberg. We deal with a lot of those issues ourselves. We've got transfer pricing specialists who can also help us demystify some of the rules and give us a better answer in terms of how companies can actually start structuring better to avoid some of the restrictions that they're looking to take into having to take into account going forward.
Neil, so do you have a top tip that you would give to a client in terms of managing their tax deductibility risk?
I think what I would concentrate on first of all is CIR and whether there's any opportunity to maybe exploit the rules or find something in those rules which give you an advantage over and above simply thinking about whether I've got a 2 million deduction or I'm stuck with the 30% fixed ratio. There is a piece of legislation in there which is optional, and so you can make an election, which is the group ratio. And I would encourage anyone who looks at the CIR rules to think about the group ratio, and particularly where there's obviously an international group behind the UK company, and looking at what the leverage is in the group overall, because it's often the case that that is going to be potentially highly leveraged itself. And we can actually, what the rules essentially give that opportunity to give some symmetry to that in the UK. What about you, Mark?
The key point that I would take away from this is, the tax landscape where we are now is different. It's moved on. It's clearly moved on. It's more complicated. Even the last 6 months, never mind the last 3 years. I would say it's important for businesses to really think about their structures going forward. What they did 3-5 years ago may not be relevant and may not be correct in terms of getting to the right or the expected tax position that they're looking for. So I think, for me, it's speaking to the right people and thinking about their structure going forward and whether it is fit for purpose. Thanks, Neil. If you'd like more information about the tax deductibility of interest, please contact me or Neil Insull to get more details.